The autumn air carried a sharp, metallic bite that seemed to freeze the very marrow of Anthony's bones, mirroring the desolate stillness that had taken root within his heart for the past 3 agonizing years. Every morning unfolded like a cruel repetition of gray canvas, stretching across a horizon devoid of promise, where the fading echoes of a fractured life continued to haunt the empty corridors of his suburban home. He moved through the motions of existence like a ghost tethered to the physical plane, his spirit eroded by the relentless tides of grief and unexpressed regrets that weighed upon his shoulders with the gravity of lead. It was during these quiet, torturous hours of pre-dawn solitude that he found himself standing before the heavy oak door of his grandfather's abandoned study, a forbidden sanctuary untouched since the old man's passing. A pause was not how he had ever imagined her. The house itself felt alive with history, its creaking floorboards whispering secrets of resilience and endurance that Anthony was too broken to comprehend, yet desperate enough to seek as a drowning man clutches at driftwood. He gripped the cold brass handle, his knuckles whitening as he hesitated on the precipice of a memory, knowing that stepping over the threshold meant confronting the ghosts he had spent a lifetime running from. The darkness inside the room was thick, smelling of old paper, dried lavender, and the faint, comforting aroma of pipe tobacco, instantly transporting him back to the summers of his youth, when the world made sense, and hope was not a foreign concept. He felt a profound ache in his chest, a physical manifestation of a soul yearning to break free from the cocoon of its own making, crying out for a renaissance that felt perpetually out of reach. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he pushed the door open, allowing a solitary beam of pale morning light to pierce the gloom, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air like fallen stars waiting to be redeemed. This was not merely a room, but a psychological battleground where the remnants of his past collided violently with the uncertain fog of his future, demanding an accounting of the dreams he had abandoned along the way. In that fragile instant, standing between the familiarity of his sorrow and the terrifying unknown of the shadows ahead, Anthony realized that the true journey was not about escaping the darkness, but learning how to breathe while walking through it. As Anthony stepped fully into the forgotten study, the heavy door clicked shut behind him with a finality that echoed like a gavel falling in an empty courtroom of the soul. The silence of the space was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock that had long since stopped keeping real time, serving instead as a haunting reminder of moments lost to the relentless march of years. He approached the mahogany desk, its surface buried beneath thick layers of dust and forgotten correspondence, a tangible archive of a life lived with passion and purpose that contrasted sharply with his own stagnant existence. With cautious reverence, he brushed away the gray residue from the corner of a leather-bound journal, his fingertips tracing the embossed initials of his grandfather, a man who had survived the crucible of war only to cultivate a garden of profound peace. Each object in the room seemed to possess a voice, whispering indictments of his current paralysis, while offering silent testimonies of endurance, challenging him to look beyond the surface of his immediate pain. He opened the journal, the stiff pages protesting gently against the sudden intrusion of light and air, revealing dense, elegant cursive that recorded triumphs and tragedies with equal grace and unwavering dignity. Here was a record of a man who had buried 2 children, yet still found the strength to plant apple trees whose fruit he would never harvest, a testament to a selfless vision of the future that Anthony had entirely forgotten how to harbor. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent so long mourning the wreck of his own expectations that he had neglected the delicate architecture of the present moment, where true healing actually begins. He turned the pages, absorbing the ink-stained wisdom of a generation that understood the alchemy of turning grief into fertilizer for the soul, transforming bitter tears into the sweet nectar of profound empathy. A sudden wave of self-compassion washed over him, hot and cleansing, dissolving the hard shell of resentment that had encrusted his heart, and allowing him to shed the heavy armor of invulnerability he had worn for far too long. In the quiet intimacy of that dusty room, surrounded by the ghosts of yesterday, Anthony began to untangle the knotted threads of his identity, recognizing that his scars were not badges of failure, but maps of survival. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long, amber fingers across the hardwood floor and illuminating a peculiar brass compass resting near the edge of the cluttered desk, catching the light like a beacon in a stormy sea. Anthony reached out and picked it up, feeling its reassuring weight in his palm, remembering how his grandfather used to say that a compass does not tell you where you are, but reminds you who you are when you are lost. Those words resonated through the chambers of his memory, unlocking a forgotten floodgate of childhood summers spent exploring the dense pine forests behind the property, where every trail was an invitation to wonder and discovery. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, catching the ghostly scent of pine needles and damp earth that seemed to linger beneath the layers of indoor dust, waking up dormant nerve endings that had been numbed by chronic despair. This sensory awakening acted as a powerful antidote to his emotional paralysis, pulling him gently back into the world of the living through the back door of nostalgia and unvarnished truth. He realized that the boy who used to run fearlessly through those woods had not died. He had simply been buried alive beneath the avalanche of adult disappointments, broken promises, and the crushing weight of societal expectations. The compass needle quivered before settling firmly toward the north, an unspoken challenge to reorient his life toward purpose, rather than drifting aimlessly on the turbulent currents of circumstance and self-pity. He walked over to the tall sash window, pushing it open to let the crisp autumn breeze rush into the stagnant room, filling his lungs with oxygen and blowing away the cobwebs of his mind with fierce, unapologetic grace. Outside, the landscape was undergoing its own magnificent transformation, as the fiery reds and golds of autumn foliage signaled a necessary dying process that was essential for the rebirth of spring. Anthony watched a flock of geese wedge their way across the pale blue sky, Their synchronized flight, a silent sermon on community, resilience, and the courage required to navigate seasons of profound transition. A fragile spark of hope, no larger than a match flame in a gale, flickered to life within his chest, warming the cold spaces and whispering that it was not too late to rewrite the narrative of his existence. Turning away from the window, Anthony felt a sudden, fierce surge of clarity that swept through his mind like a cleansing fire, incinerating the lingering illusions of control that had bound him to his past suffering. He looked around the study, not with the heavy eyes of a prisoner surveying his cell, but with the compassionate gaze of an archaeologist uncovering the ruins of a civilization that had learned how to rise from the ashes. It became overwhelmingly clear that his refusal to forgive himself for the unraveling of his marriage and the derailment of his career was the very anchor dragging him down into the murky depths of depression. He had spent years fighting the reality of what was, locked in an exhausting wrestling match with time and memory, demanding that the universe rewrite a tragic chapter that had already been permanently inked in the book of life. Slowly, deliberately, he sank into the worn leather armchair behind the desk, the springs groaning in protest before accommodating his weight, inviting him to finally surrender to the gravity of his own vulnerability. In that quiet surrender, a profound transformation occurred. The tightness in his throat dissolved into quiet sobs, and the tears he had withheld for over 1,000 days finally broke free, washing away the salt of ancient bitterness. He wept for the lost dreams, for the innocence he could never reclaim, and for the sheer exhaustion of pretending to be strong when every cell in his body was screaming for rest and gentle restoration. This was not a collapse of spirit, but a holy breaking, the shattering of a rigid ego that made space for a softer, more resilient humanity to emerge from the wreckage of his shattered illusions. As the crying subsided, leaving him emotionally exhausted, yet remarkably light, he felt the invisible chains of his history finally slip away from his wrists, leaving behind raw, sensitive skin, ready to heal under the open air. He picked up his grandfather's pen, the metal cool against his fingers, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to imagine a tomorrow that was not defined by yesterday's mistakes, but by today's quiet courage. The room was now bathed in the deep, velvety indigo of twilight, casting long shadows that no longer felt menacing, but rather like protective blankets, wrapping around the convalescent soul of a man finding his way home. Anthony closed the leather journal with a soft thud that resonated with finality and new beginnings, knowing that he had crossed an invisible boundary from which there was no turning back to the comfortable numbness of despair. He stood up straight, his posture unconsciously aligning with a renewed sense of self-respect, feeling the blood course through his veins with a vibrant energy that had been absent for far too long. Walking over to the door, he paused for a brief moment to look back at the sanctuary that had served as the incubator for his spiritual resurrection, feeling an immense wave of gratitude for the ancestors who watched over him. As he stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy door partially shut, the darkness of the study no longer seemed terrifying, but rather like a storage room for a past he no longer needed to inhabit full time. He walked down the wooden staircase, each step sounding confident and grounded against the floorboards, carrying him toward the brightly lit kitchen where the modern world awaited, with all its messy, beautiful, and unpredictable challenges. He turned on the kettle, watching the water bubble and steam as it prepared to offer warmth and comfort, a simple domestic ritual that suddenly felt sacred in its ordinary grace and healing potential. The phone on the counter buzzed with missed notifications, but for the first time, he felt no anxious compulsion to immediately check them, realizing that his time and his peace belonged to him alone to manage and protect. Opening the back door, he stepped out onto the porch, lifting his face to the cool evening breeze and the first emerging stars that pierced the velvet canopy of the night sky with quiet brilliance. Anthony took a deep, steadying breath, his heart beating with a steady, defiant rhythm that declared to the universe he was battered, bruised, but unequivocally alive and ready to write the next chapter of his journey. The morning mist hung low over the valley, clinging to the ancient oaks like unspoken words that refused to dissolve in the light of day. For months, Arthur had walked this same boundary line, measuring his grief not in hours or days, but in the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots against the frost-bitten earth. There is a profound isolation that settles deep within the marrow when a life you spent decades building dissolves overnight into a quiet, uninhabited room. He often stopped by the old stone wall, the place where he and Clara used to sit during the late September afternoons, sharing thermos coffee and speaking in the shorthand of a long marriage. Now, the silence was no longer a comforting companion. It was a physical presence, dense and suffocating, pressing against his ribs with every breath he tried to draw. He had spent so long guarding his sorrow, treating it like a fragile heirloom that needed to be preserved in the dark, that he had nearly forgotten the sensation of the sun on his face. Yet, beneath the numbness, a faint, stubborn pulse remained, a quiet realization that the winter of the soul, no matter how absolute it feels, is never the final chapter of the earth. Life has a relentless way of stripping away the scaffolding we construct to keep our fears at bay. For Arthur, that scaffolding had been routine. The meticulously planned days, the predictable schedules, the quiet illusion of control over a world that is inherently wild and indifferent to our desires. When the storm finally hit, washing out the lower bridge and isolating his property from the nearest town, it also washed away the fragile buffer he had erected against his own vulnerability. Sitting by the hearth with only a flickering candle for company, he was forced to confront the debris of his past choices, the unfulfilled promises, and the quiet grief of roads not taken. It was an uncomfortable reckoning, a dismantling of the identity he had worn for so long as armor. In that dim, flickering light, he understood that healing does not begin when the storm passes, everything is restored to its original order. Rather, true renewal begins precisely at the moment when the last illusion of control shatters, leaving us standing bare and unshielded before the vast, unpredictable expanse of our own becoming. Days blurred into one another as the isolation persisted, transforming from a trial into an unexpected sanctuary. Deprived of the frantic distractions of the modern world, Arthur began to notice the small, miraculous details of survival unfolding right outside his window. The stubborn green shoots of wild garlic pushing through the heavy snow, the red-tailed hawk circling effortlessly above the canyon, indifferent to human sorrow. He started to spend his afternoons working with his hands, repairing the splintered wooden gate and tending to the neglected greenhouse, where dormant seeds still held the memory of summer. Each task was slow and deliberate, requiring a quiet patience that seeped gradually into his fractured spirit. He gathered the broken pieces of his routine, not to rebuild the old life, but to fashion something entirely new, something more porous and forgiving. As he turned the rich, dark soil, he felt an ancient kinship with the earth beneath his fingernails, a reminder that beauty is so often born from decay, and that our deepest wounds are frequently the very spaces through which grace finally finds its way in. There comes a turning point in every prolonged winter when the air shifts, carrying a faint, unmistakable scent of damp earth and coming rain that speaks of resurrection long before the first bud appears. Arthur felt this shift one afternoon as he stood on the ridge, watching the gray clouds part to reveal a vast, bruised sky painted in shades of lavender and gold. For the first time in years, the horizon did not look like a boundary meant to hem him in, but like an open invitation, a beckoning expanse that whispered of unwritten tomorrows. He realized that holding on to grief as a permanent identity was a way of hiding from the terrifying, magnificent responsibility of living. The world was waiting for him, not with judgment or demands, but with the quiet generosity of dawn. He took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs to their very edges. And for the first time, the ache in his chest was accompanied by a strange, soaring lightness. He was not the man he had been before the loss, nor was he entirely a stranger to himself. He was someone larger, softer, and infinitely more capable of enduring the brilliant. The journey back to the world was not marked by fanfare or dramatic epiphanies, but by the quiet grace of ordinary moments lived with an open heart. Arthur walked down the hillside into the awakening village, his walking stick rhythmically tapping against the gravel, his eyes attuned to the golden light spilling across the rooftops. When he passed the old bakery, he paused to exchange a warm, unhurried greeting with the baker, a simple human connection that felt, after his long exile, like a profound blessing. He understood now that healing is not a destination where we arrive and finally put down our burdens forever. It is a continuous practice of returning to the present, of choosing hope again and again, even when the shadows threaten to lengthen. The road ahead was uncertain, winding through valleys of memory and over hills of new endeavor. But he walked it now with a steady stride and a luminous courage. He was part of the great, unfolding rhythm of the earth, broken and mended, weathered and renewed, ready at last to receive whatever light the morning chose to bestow. Morning arrived on the base without fanfare, bringing with it the cold, metallic hum of routine operations and the distant rumble of tides crashing against the distant rocky shoreline. I stood at my kitchen counter, watching the steam rise slowly from my coffee mug, while half listening to David explain to our young son why his winter socks did not match. The domestic calm was suddenly shattered by the sharp, familiar buzz of my mobile phone resting on the wood, displaying a Virginia area code I did not instantly recognize today. An old, well-worn instinct, born from years of classified discipline, whispered that I should step outside onto the back porch before pressing the green acceptance button. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, weathered, gravelly, and wrapped in the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades operating in the shadows of the military. "Commander Foster, this is Walt Reyes," he said. And in that single phrase, I felt the invisible walls between my two entirely separate lives thin out instantly. Master Chief Reyes had spent 30 years as a Command Master Chief in Naval Special Operations, navigating missions that officially never happened and leaving no paper trail behind. He explained carefully, picking his words with the precision of someone trained to speak on a knife's edge, that he had recognized my voice and cadence at the dinner table. It wasn't just the call sign itself, but the guarded reluctance in my tone, confirming that I had indeed belonged to the silent fraternity of Task Group 7. Standing there under the pale morning sky, watching a solitary cardinal hop along the frosted wooden railing, a profound wave of understanding washed over me. For years, I had carried the peculiar, isolating burden of being fully known by almost no one. Walking through family holidays as a half-person, present in body, but absent in history. Master Chief Reyes didn't need my classified files or redacted service jacket to understand the shape of those 14 years. He knew the exact texture of deployments with no ports of call. We spoke in that careful, coded shorthand, native to those who have stood in windowless briefing rooms where survival depends entirely on absolute discretion and mutual trust. In that brief conversation, the chronic loneliness that usually accompanied my civilian life began to dissolve, replaced by the quiet reassurance of kinship. He mentioned how surreal it felt to be passing mashed potatoes to Sentinel, sharing a laugh that bridged decades of silent service across different generations of warriors. When we finally said goodbye, I lingered on the porch, realizing that while my work remained unnameable to the world, my existence was validated by those who shared the creed. It was a comforting anchor, reminding me that honor does not require a megaphone to echo through the corridors of time. Back inside the warm kitchen, David was pouring a fresh cup of coffee, his expression unreadable in the familiar way it assumed whenever my other life brushed against our ordinary world. He never asked who had called or what was discussed, having learned over 11 years of marriage exactly where the boundary lines lay without needing me to draw them. It was one of the deepest reasons I loved him. He never forced me to choose between honesty and honor, simply waiting patiently on the other side of the silence. But out in the wider world, Ryan was not nearly as restrained, struggling immensely to process the minor earthquake that had disrupted his carefully curated narrative. According to David, who heard filtered whispers from relatives days later, Ryan had been telling anyone who would listen that the encounter with Master Chief Reyes was a mere coincidence. Yet beneath his frantic denials, Ryan had begun asking quiet questions to old contacts at the base, fishing for information about a lieutenant commander named Samantha Foster. He was a man desperately searching for a scoreboard he could understand, completely unaware that his frantic inquiries were drawing unwanted attention from military authorities. In his relentless pursuit to prove himself superior, Ryan was unwittingly stepping onto a dangerous legal battlefield, poking at locked doors that were guarded by federal regulations and enforced by the unyielding iron fist of operational security. Every single attempt Ryan made to pierce the veil of my service history hit the same impenetrable concrete wall of classified protocols and absolute denial. When his inquiries reached personnel records and old classmates at the Pentagon, they were met with a single chilling line that echoed across his computer screen. Access denied. Even a senior officer with respectable clearance warned him privately that continuing to dig into Task Group 7 would invite severe consequences from command security. For a man who had built his entire identity on being the family's foremost symbol of American courage, discovering the existence of a world far larger than his own induced profound vertigo. He had measured his worth against a fixed, highly visible scoreboard of surface warfare, assuming that my desk job was the ceiling of my capabilities. To learn that I operated several tiers above his authorized clearance, in spaces he was legally barred from even imagining, shattered his foundational assumptions about hierarchy and merit. He didn't know how to reconcile his condescension with the terrifying reality that his quiet sister-in-law had carried responsibilities that made his career look like a training exercise. In his confusion, Ryan retreated into stubborn denial, convincing himself and a few gullible relatives that the entire incident was an elaborate misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by an old man's failing memory. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted deeply in his mind, gnawing at his ego and setting the stage for a confrontation he could neither avoid nor win. As the autumn days shortened and the leaves outside turned brittle and gold, I felt the inevitable approach of a reckoning that could no longer be postponed by polite family silences. Ryan was incapable of letting a mystery dissolve quietly, especially one that threatened his self-proclaimed status as the ultimate warrior of the family lineage. He needed to regain control of the narrative, to prove once and for all that his civilian-turned-officer sister-in-law was merely an anomaly in an otherwise predictable world of military service. Little did he know, his persistent behind-the-scenes meddling had already flagged the attention of command investigators who monitored unauthorized probes into special operations archives. While Ryan plotted his next public maneuver to corner me, the unyielding machinery of military discipline was quietly turning in the background to protect the boundaries he was dancing dangerously close to crossing. I spent those quiet evenings reviewing training manuals, sipping tea with David, finding immense peace in the knowledge that truth does not need to shout to prevail. The storm was coming, fueled entirely by Ryan's desperate need for validation. But I stood ready, not with anger or malice, but with the steady, unshakable composure of someone who had weathered far worse in the dead of night. The journey back toward light rarely begins with a grand revelation. Rather, it starts with the quiet, deliberate choice to stop fighting the gravity of one's own grief. For months, the weight of unresolved sorrow had felt like an immovable anchor, dragging every ambition into the cold depths of self-doubt. Yet, as the early morning fog lifted over the pine-scented hills, a subtle shift occurred within the architecture of the soul. Healing did not demand the complete erasure of past pain, but rather the creation of a larger container, capable of holding both the ache of what was lost and the soft promise of what might still be built. Walking along the frost-dusted trail, each step felt like a silent declaration of independence from the lingering ghosts of yesterday. The air was crisp, biting with the sharp honesty of late autumn, cutting through the mental haze that had long obscured the horizon. To accept the past was not to surrender to it. It was to acknowledge the terrain, so that a new path could finally be forged. The heart, once frozen in a perpetual winter of regret, began to thaw under the gentle, persistent warmth of self-compassion. It became clear that survival was merely the baseline, but true living required the courage to open old wounds to the fresh air, allowing them to heal into silver scars that spoke not of defeat, but of endurance, grace, and an enduring capacity to begin again. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting golden ribbons across the forest floor, the necessity of releasing external expectations became strikingly clear. For too long, identity had been tied to the approval of others, a heavy armor worn to protect against the sting of judgment, yet one that ultimately prevented any real movement or authentic connection. Stripping away those artificial layers felt terrifying, like stepping naked into a winter wind. Yet it was the only way to discover what truly remained beneath the performance. True strength, it turned out, was not found in a flawless facade, but in the vulnerable acknowledgement of one's own limitations and messy human truths. In the quiet solitude of the woods, where trees stood unbothered by the need to justify their barren branches to the sky, a profound sense of relief took root. The constant need to measure up to an imaginary standard began to evaporate, replaced by a quiet, unshakable self-acceptance. Every breath felt lighter, every thought clearer, as the burden of seeking validation was gently set down on the damp earth. This shift was not an act of isolation, but an invitation to step into the world with radical authenticity. By honoring one's inner voice above the chorus of outside opinions, the spirit gained the ground it needed to stand firm, rooted deeply in its own truth, ready to navigate whatever weather the coming seasons might bring. With a heart unburdened by past regrets and freed from the trap of approval, attention naturally turned toward the immediate present, the only space where real transformation can ever occur. The modern world often demands that we live 3 steps ahead, perpetually anxious about an uncertain future. Yet true peace resides strictly in the current moment. Looking down at the rugged path ahead, the goal was no longer to conquer the entire mountain in a single frantic leap, but to focus entirely on the single, deliberate step right in front of the foot. There was a quiet dignity in this minimalist approach to progress, a recognition that monumental life shifts are merely the cumulative effect of small, unremarkable choices made with discipline and love. The rush of stream water over smooth river stones served as a constant reminder that nature moves with patient intention, never hurrying, yet accomplishing everything in its time. By anchoring consciousness in the sensory richness of the now, the tactile roughness of tree bark, the rhythm of steady breathing, the shifting pattern of shadow and light, the ambient noise of anxiety faded into silence. Life stopped being a frantic puzzle to be solved and became instead a canvas to be experienced depth by depth, breath by breath, with open hands and an attentive heart. As the trail opened onto a vast, wind-swept overlook, a newfound clarity began to illuminate the purpose behind the pain that had once felt so senseless. Grief and hardship were no longer viewed as arbitrary punishments, but as grueling, necessary sculptors of the soul, carving out deep valleys within the psyche so they could eventually hold greater capacities for empathy, joy, and purpose. The wounds of the past transformed into a unique kind of wisdom, a quiet, grounded authority that could only be earned by walking through the fire and coming out intact on the other side. This realization birthed a profound sense of gratitude, not necessarily for the suffering itself, but for the resilience it had forged and the deep kinship it revealed with the shared human condition. Looking out over the sprawling canopy below, the interconnectedness of all things became undeniable. No personal struggle is ever endured in complete isolation, and every restored spirit becomes a beacon for others still lost in the dark. The energy that had once been consumed by self-pity was now repurposed into a burning desire to serve, to uplift, and to build something meaningful from the ashes. Pain had surrendered its power to break the spirit and had instead been transmuted into the very fuel required to propel the soul into its next highest evolutionary chapter. Standing at the edge of the overlook, bathed in the full brilliance of the midday light, a deep, resonant conviction took hold. The future was not something to be feared, but a vast, beautiful territory waiting to be written. The narrative of brokenness had reached its natural end, giving way to a story defined by intentionality, courage, and unyielding hope. A quiet joy, subtle yet unbreakable, bubbled up from the depths of being. Not the fleeting happiness of good fortune, but the profound serenity that comes from knowing one can withstand the storm and still choose to bloom. Reaching into the morning air, there was no longer a need to look back over the shoulder to check if old shadows were following. They had dissolved in the clarity of the present light. With a clear vision and a restored heart, the journey forward felt less like a struggle for survival and more like an eager, graceful march toward full self-actualization. Every cell seemed aligned with a higher purpose, vibrating with the quiet confidence of someone who has looked into the abyss, embraced their own darkness, and emerged holding their own torch. The path stretched onward into the unknown, no longer intimidating, but radiant with infinite possibilities, calling the renewed spirit to step forward boldly and claim the vibrant life that had been waiting all along. The Officers' Club at the naval base was an exquisite, high-ceilinged hall filled with gleaming white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, and the subdued hum of refined military conversation. Hosted by the wealthy family of Ryan's fiancée to celebrate their formal engagement, the elegant room was populated by far more high-ranking military brass than a routine family gathering usually warranted. I stood quietly beside David near the perimeter, wearing my simple evening attire, while observing the elaborate stage Ryan had painstakingly constructed for his own personal glory and validation. He had strategically invited his former commanding officers and visiting staff members, eager to secure their high opinions and showcase his status as the undisputed star of the family. Ryan waited patiently until dessert was served, allowing the fine wine to loosen inhibitions and warm the room, before executing his premeditated dramatic maneuver against my quiet presence. He stood up confidently at the head table, glass in hand, tapping his fork against the crystal to command absolute silence across the densely filled dining room. With a performative ease that barely masked the desperate tightness around his eyes, he offered a brief, charming toast to his fiancée before turning his sharp focus toward me. Before we wrap up this wonderful evening, I want to clear something up for everyone present, Ryan announced loudly, his booming voice echoing across the silent hall. He stared directly at me with a smirk of arrogant triumph, confident that he was about to publicly dismantle my reputation and finally put me in my place once and for all today. Sensing his clear intention to turn a joyful family celebration into a bitter public trial, I maintained my absolute composure, keeping my expression entirely unbothered, dignified, and calm throughout. Sam, why don't you tell everyone what you actually do in the Navy? Ryan challenged loudly, spreading his hands wide to draw every single eye in the room directly to our table. No vague answers this time, no hiding behind the word classified. Just tell us the plain truth, he insisted, inviting the entire room to laugh at my personal expense. I set my dessert fork down without any haste, looked straight into his eager eyes, and answered simply, "I can't do that, Ryan. And you know I can't." Ryan chuckled triumphantly, turning to the surrounding officers like a confident prosecutor delivering a closing argument in a high-stakes courtroom drama before a captive audience. "That is my exact point," he declared smugly. "There is nothing to tell, folks. She works a routine desk job filing mundane paperwork, and that's the whole unglamorous story." He raised his wineglass high, as if the matter were permanently settled, entirely unaware that his arrogant public provocation had set off an unforeseen, powerful chain reaction. Across the room, an influential rear admiral who had just stepped up to the podium for official toasts suddenly paused, his sharp eyes locking directly onto me across the crowded hall. Recognizing my face immediately, the Admiral set his official notes aside and began walking deliberately toward our table, cutting a clean, purposeful path through the deeply stunned crowd today. The entire room fell into a breathless, heavy hush as the silver-haired Rear Admiral approached our table, bypassing senior base commanders to reach me directly without any hesitation whatsoever today. Ryan's wineglass froze halfway to his lips, the color rapidly draining from his pale face as he realized his orchestrated triumph was instantly unraveling right before his very eyes. The Admiral extended his hand with deep respect, and I stood to accept the firm, familiar handshake of a distinguished leader who had shared harrowing operational history with me during my military service. Turning to face the quiet audience, the Admiral held my hand for a moment longer, ensuring every officer present understood the immense significance and gravity of the sacred moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what was discussed here tonight, but I want to say something clearly. The Admiral spoke, his voice carrying undeniable authority across the room. This officer, Commander Samantha Foster, has saved American lives more times than most people in this room will ever know, in operations you will never be cleared to hear about. He paused, looking directly at Ryan before continuing. There is no braver, more dedicated officer wearing this uniform tonight, and the Navy never forgets her selfless service. A wave of genuine awe rippled through the hall as senior officers began to stand, initiating a thunderous standing ovation that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Ryan stood utterly motionless beside me, his carefully constructed narrative shattered into dust as the audience he assembled honored the true hero standing before them today. As the thunderous applause gradually subsided, the Rear Admiral offered me a warm, respectful nod before returning to his distinguished colleagues, leaving behind an atmosphere permanently transformed by truth. Ryan slumped heavily into his chair, staring blankly at his trembling hands, completely unable to process or comprehend the total, sudden collapse of his public performance before his peers. The junior officers he had spent the entire evening trying to impress now looked at me with genuine, unguarded reverence, whispering the name Sentinel in hushed, deeply respectful tones across the hall. Underneath the crisp white linen tablecloth, David found my hand and gripped it tightly, his bright eyes shining with quiet pride, profound love, and deep, overwhelming emotional relief today. There was no lingering malice or petty triumph in my heart, only the quiet, unhurried satisfaction of a truth that had finally been permitted to stand firmly on its own feet. Ryan's fiancée and her parents looked at him with profound disappointment, recognizing the tragic, consuming insecurity that had driven him to attack his own devoted family member in public. The relentless need to dominate had stripped Ryan of his dignity, exposing the hollow, fragile nature of an identity built entirely on superficial vanity and public applause. For 14 long years, I had allowed people to underestimate me, knowing that real, enduring strength never needs to raise its voice or demand validation from the crowd. In that sacred moment of quiet, complete vindication, the long winter of misunderstanding dissolved, leaving behind an unshakable foundation of dignity, honor, and authentic self-respect today. Leaving the officers' club that evening, the cool night air felt extraordinarily refreshing against my skin, carrying the sweet, unmistakable promise of a brand new chapter, free from lingering shadows. David wrapped his arm warmly around my shoulders as we walked toward our car, the quiet intimacy between us feeling stronger and far more profound than ever before in our marriage. We drove home in comfortable, peaceful silence, the rhythmic hum of the quiet highway accompanying a deep, healing peace that settled over both our hearts like a comforting blanket. David squeezed my hand gently, whispering how deeply he admired my enduring patience, my grace, and the unwavering dignity I had shown through long years of silent, selfless endurance. I looked out the window at the starlit sky, realizing that the evening's events were not merely about exposing Ryan's arrogance, but about liberating our entire family from lingering deception. By allowing the truth to emerge naturally, without anger or retaliation, we had broken the toxic, exhausting cycle of competition that had burdened our lives for far too long. The long journey through service, secrecy, and misunderstanding had forged an unbreakable bond between us, grounded in mutual respect, quiet honor, and unconditional love today. Standing on our front porch, breathing in the fresh night air, I felt immense gratitude for the quiet path I had walked and the love that had sustained me throughout everything. We stepped inside our warm home together, completely whole, deeply healed, and ready to embrace a bright future filled with abiding peace, truth, and lasting joy today. The morning light did not break through the horizon with a triumphant blare of gold, but rather drifted in like a quiet confession, slow and hesitant across the frost-bitten window pane. In the stillness of that long-awaited dawn, the heavy weight that had rested upon the chest for countless seasons began to shift, not with a violent crack, but with the gentle, barely audible sigh of a sleeping winter yielding to the first faint promise of spring. Outside, the bare oak branches held small beads of dew, each tiny sphere catching the pale sun, transforming yesterday's icy sorrow into a constellation of liquid light. For a long time, grief had been a silent companion in this room, a heavy coat worn so long that its texture felt like second skin, dark and suffocatingly familiar. Yet, standing there, listening to the soft murmur of the distant river finding its course over smoothed river stones, a quiet truth began to stir within the soul. Sorrow had not come to destroy the foundation of the spirit. It had come to clear away the clutter of false expectations, leaving behind an open, sacred space where light could finally settle. To sit with one's own pain without turning away is perhaps the quietest form of bravery. It is the moment we stop running from the shadows of our yesterday and realize that the dark was only ever the absence of our own permission to shine. As warmth stretched across the hardwood floors, there was no rush to fix what was broken, only a profound, tender willingness to exist, fragile, breathing, and whole. Stepping out onto the porch, the air carried the crisp, rich scent of damp earth and pine, an ancient perfume that reminded the heart of how relentlessly life insists on renewing itself. Across the lane, an old wooden fence, weathered by decades of harsh winds and scorching midsummers, stood covered in wild green moss, its deep cracks transformed into tiny, thriving ecosystems. It was a simple, unspoken lesson written into the grain of the wood, that beauty does not require perfection, nor does healing demand the complete absence of scars. In truth, the deepest wounds are often the very threshold where grace enters our lives, carving out a deeper reservoir so that joy may one day fill it to the brim. A neighbor walked past in the distance, waving a slow, familiar hand, a silent gesture that required no explanation, no performance of strength, no masking of the lingering quiet inside. That simple human connection anchored the heart to the present moment, dissolving the illusory isolation that grief so cunningly weaves around the mind. We are never as alone as our deepest fears would have us believe. We are bound together by an invisible, resilient thread of shared vulnerability. Looking down at hands that had clutched so tightly to what was lost, there was a sudden, delicate unclenching of the fingers. The air felt lighter. The breath expanded deeper into the lungs. And for the very first time in what felt like a lifetime, the burden of carrying the past ceased to feel like a permanent life sentence, becoming instead a humble stepping stone. Forgiveness, it turned out, was not a grand event marked by theatrical declarations, but a quiet, solitary practice of laying down arms against one's own memory. For years, the mind had played the role of both judge and jury, endlessly replaying old mistakes, missed opportunities, and words that hung suspended in the cold air of regret. But as the afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the worn pages of an old journal, a deep wave of compassion washed over the interior landscape. The past self had not acted out of malice or weakness, but out of a desperate human need to survive. the only way it knew how at the time. To hold that younger, bruised version of oneself in a gentle embrace, without judgment or demand for revision, was the true beginning of restoration. Every scar carried a story, yes, but a story is not a life sentence. It is merely the setting from which the hero chooses to rise. In the quiet cathedral of self-acceptance, the bitter inner dialogue fell silent, replaced by a soft, resonant gratitude for the endurance of the human heart. How remarkable it is that the spirit can shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces and yet possess the inherent, quiet wisdom to gather those pieces back together, binding them with threads of golden grace. In acknowledging the pain without letting it define the future, the soul found its true orientation, turning away from the rearview mirror and gazing steadily into the vast, unwritten horizon ahead. By late afternoon, the path led down to the edge of the quiet meadow, where wild goldenrod swayed softly in the cool breeze, bowing to an invisible rhythm. Walking slowly through the tall grass, every step felt deliberate, a grounded affirmation of belonging to this vast, living tapestry of the world. Reaching into a pocket, a small river stone, carried for months as a physical anchor for silent worry, was lifted up and held against the light, its surface worn smooth by friction and time. With a slow, deep breath that carried out every last remnant of hesitation, the stone was tossed high into the air, tracing a graceful arc before plunging into the cool depths of the stream with a gentle, definitive splash. The ripples expanded outward, touching both banks before dissolving smoothly into the current, leaving the surface pristine once more. It was an act of sacred release, a deliberate choice to stop holding on to what was never meant to be kept. Nature does not cling to its fallen leaves, nor does the river mourn the water that has already flowed past its banks. Both simply trust the grand, ongoing rhythm of dynamic creation. Standing at the water's edge, watching the stream carry the weight away into the distance, a profound sense of lightened presence settled deep within the chest. The heart was no longer a vessel filled with heavy memories, but an open channel through which life, in all its raw, unpredictable beauty, could freely flow. As dusk descended, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of violet, rose, and deep indigo, the world seemed to pause in reverence for the quiet victory of a soul restored. Healing is not the magical return to who we were before the storm. It is the courage to step forward into who we have become because of it. Stronger, softer, and infinitely wiser. Standing on the ridge, looking out over the quiet valley where small house lights were beginning to twinkle like fallen stars, a wave of radiant hope washed over the spirit. Life had not promised an absence of trials, but it had promised the endless capacity for renewal, the undeniable truth that after every long, dark night, light will inevitably claim its place. The scars remained, etched like delicate silver veins upon the heart. But they no longer represented pain. They were glorious proof of survival, badges of honor worn by one who had walked through the fire and emerged whole. To live fully is to embrace both the joy and the sorrow, knowing that both are essential threads in the tapestry of a meaningful existence. With a heart unburdened and eyes clear with newfound purpose, the path back home felt light, welcoming, and rich with promise. Step by step, surrounded by the calm dignity of the emerging stars, the journey continued, not with the frantic urge to reach a destination, but with the quiet, triumphant joy of simply being alive, healed, and completely